Hello, hello. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining Mass Live AZ tonight. This is an important and timely conversation about Palestine and colonization. I'm grateful to welcome you into the space so that we can sort through the misinformation, the disinformation, and get real about the ongoing harm of colonization and the ethnic cleansing going on right now in Palestine. What's happening in Gaza right now is genocide, and our tax dollars are funding it. While we wait for folks to arrive, please enter into the chat. Where are you joining us from? And what are you hoping to learn from this important conversation? Also, while we're waiting to get started, please play with your Zoom view. There's so many people who are joining in the space. There's a lot of people in the room already, and the Zoom app may interfere with your slides. So just experiment with your view so that you don't miss the slides. There's some beautiful photos of Palestine in black and white. Hopefully you're able to see those. I'm just gonna show those for a few minutes till everybody joins. I think we lost our music again. That's okay. Beautiful photos of Palestine. Take a look at them, they're rare. And also, while we wait to get started, please add your name and your pronouns to your Zoom profile. Turn on your camera so that you can be in community with us. All right, cool. Let's go ahead and get started. My name is Lola. I am with Mass Liberation Arizona. And for those of you who are brand new to Mass Lib AZ, we are a Black liberation-focused, directly impacted-led abolitionist organization, and we're headquartered in South Phoenix, Arizona. Our work to abolish policing in prisons is led by Black and directly impacted people. And we know that putting people in cages is never the answer, whether it is a prison or a concentration camp, closed wall or open air. All prisons must be abolished, and that means everywhere, including Gaza. That's why what's happening in Palestine is our struggle too, because Israel has 2.3 million Gazan refugees caged in a concentration camp in a place that is the size of Detroit, and our government supports and funds this violent colonial project. This is our work. And let's remember that next Thursday, as most Americans are going to be celebrating Thanksgiving, which we like to call Thanks-taking, as a holiday, which is just propaganda to glorify the violence of settler colonialism and to try to make us think that it's natural and a welcome part of life. We must resist and disrupt that narrative. We can't normalize this. Just as we witness what's happening in Palestine while colonial forces occupy the land and kill everyone in their path, we must remember that Native American people here in the United States are still experiencing decimation that has lasted over 400 years. And we are those settlers now. We are those settlers now. We're all living on unceded, occupied land that was taken from Indigenous people. Let that sink in for a second. And we're watching in real time as the US and other colonizing nations support and fund Israel's attempted genocide of Palestinian people right now. So tonight, we'll talk about the history of Palestine, as well as our government's role in the colonial projects so that we will more clearly understand the dynamics of imperialism and white supremacy and how they're working from everything between our politics and the news we watch. So tonight's going to be a lot of information, and that's a good thing, but please interact with us. So when you're hearing something that resonates with you, drop emoji in the chat, say something in the chat, say something about what you think and how you're feeling, interact with us. One other thing that's really important for us to know is that this is a pro-Palestine event. We are not here to debate Gaza's right to resist apartheid, their right to resist the occupation, or their right to exist. We maintain that resistance is valid and justified. International law states that occupied people have a right to resist by any means necessary, and we will not debate that. Finally, anyone using Islamophobic, anti-Semitic, anti-Black, anti-Indigenous language is going to be removed from this meeting immediately by our security team. No questions asked. Okay, and the other thing I want to let you know is that we're going to try our best to move through this agenda quickly. We want to do it within an hour, but there's a lot of content here, a lot of interaction that we're hoping for. So we may just go over. Be prepared for that. All right, thank you again for joining us. I'm going to pass it to Julian to walk us through the values.
In the WhatsApp.
Thank you so much, Mama. Hi, everyone. I am so grateful to be in this space with you all tonight. So at MassLib, we have 10 guiding principles that are the foundation for our work. We'll share the list so you have them to reference in the future. We're centering tonight's conversation around these specific values because white supremacy operates the same way everywhere on the planet, and it is up to us to recognize and disrupt that. So whether we're talking about policing in the United States or the militarized occupation in Palestine, these values apply. So first we have all of us or none of us. We know any freedom we create is incomplete if our siblings in Palestine are living under occupation. The second one we have is justice reinvestment. It is truly staggering to think about the money that our government government funnels to Israel to fund the ethnic cleansing in Palestine and maintain our military stronghold there. Just like we work to divest from policing here and invest in communities instead, we need to stop funding Israel's militarized occupation. The third value is we center the leadership of directly impacted people. The people closest to the problem are the closest to the solution, always. That's why it's not up to us to theorize solutions, but to listen to and trust Palestinian voices and resistance. It's also important because we have global media corporations and electeds pushing a false narrative, so we have to seek out news from people on the ground in Gaza. Social media makes it easier for them to share what is actually going on, so we know the truth. Our fourth value tonight is the system isn't broken, it was designed this way. So on a local level, we've seen city officials like Mayor Kate and Phoenix City Council support and fund Phoenix Police Department's killing and targeting of Black people. Maricopa County Attorney's Office falsely charges and prosecutes freedom fighters. So as we look at the systems that enable ethnic cleansing to persist without any intervention, it is obvious that our electeds don't represent us, but are paid for by Israel. We demand a ceasefire, and they vote to send billions more in weapons to Israel. The news reports pro-Israel propaganda, and our schools and universities are silence Palestinian student groups, calling them terrorist organizations. We see institutions, and every day people support this genocide with their silence and unwillingness to denounce an apartheid regime. We need to be clear that this is not a tragic mistake, it is by design. So ultimately, it is up to us to resist the violence of white supremacy and colonial projects around the globe and to hold our final and most important principle. Putting people in cages is never the answer. It doesn't matter whether it's a cop or a colonizer, a jail or annexed land. A prison is a prison and it must be abolished. So as abolitionists, we work not only to abolish prisons and police in our communities, we work to abolish the police in our heads and our hearts. And like police, we also must abolish colonialism and white supremacy. Colonialism and white supremacy is everywhere in the world, and also from our head and our hearts. So tonight, let's talk about Palestine, and I will pass it to Rami to get us located on the map.
Thank you, Julian. So let's take a quick minute and get located here on the map. Now, this is already tough to do, right? Because the borders come from a colonizer mindset. And these borders have been shifting and changing for decades now as Israel continues their militarized occupation. But we'll start at the top and we'll go down in a circle just to point out where in the world we're talking about when we say the land of occupied Palestine. So, as we mentioned, Palestine is occupied by Israel. And to the north, you'll see that Palestine is bordered by Lebanon, or what we call in Arabic, Lebanon. To the right, or the east, we see that it's bordered by Syria, or what we call Syria in Arabic. Beneath Syria, we have Jordan and the Jordan River. Jordan is called Al-Urdun in Arabic. And Jordan is bordered by Iraq, so they're close neighbors. Moving south all the way down, we have the West Bank, bordered by Jordan and the Jordan River. And moving even further all the way down, we have the borders at the very south, which is Egypt, or what we call Misr in Arabic. And that's where the Rafah crossing is, the very south part of Gaza. And in this south, we have this strip of land on the Mediterranean Sea, which is called the Gaza Strip. It's 25 miles long and only 6 miles wide. And there are over 2 million people living there. It is the most densely populated area in the entire world. And it's called the Gaza Strip. And this distance of 25 miles long is actually shorter than the distance it would take to run an entire marathon. And all the way up the coast, we have on the Mediterranean, a beautiful city called Akka. So now I'm going to pass it to my beautiful mother and to Joe so we can hear more about Palestine.
Perfect. Thank you, Rami. Hello, everyone. So good to be here today. My name is Joe Larios, and I am calling from the backside, from my backyard of my house in this lovely drizzling rain. I hope you all are doing well. And so we know that the history of Palestine didn't just begin with the occupation. We also recognize that there are a lot of folks, maybe some in this room, definitely within our base, who maybe have only started to learn about Palestine like within the last month or so. And most of that learning has been primarily through news bites or like small tidbits of social media. And so we wanted to give an opportunity to learn a little bit about Palestine and the Palestinian diaspora, you know, in alignment with our third value from directly impacted lived experience. And so I have the honor and the pleasure to introduce to you all Miss Kadura. She was born in Beirut, Lebanon, to both her parents, who are Palestinian refugees forcefully displaced from their homeland in 1948. She and her husband secured student visas at the age of 22 and were able to move here to the States to raise their family. With her master's degree in education, Ms. Kadura taught math, high school math, I believe, and recently retired in the last couple of years, just like my mother who recently retired. And so thank you for being here, Ms. Kadura. I hope you are doing well. Let's make sure you are, there we go.
I'm sorry.
Perfect. I just wanted to make sure your mic worked. You were good to go. Awesome. Well, you know, we acknowledge, you know, there's a lot of labor and generosity that goes into sharing someone's lived experience and personal story. And so we just all have a lot of gratitude for your time that you're taking with us today, Ms. Kadura. So, you know, like I said, folks have, for a lot of people, you know, they're still barely learning about Palestine. And a lot of the learning has been through, you know, the lens of the current genocide that's happening. And so I thought, you know, for our first question within this conversation, I understand that your family's homeland is from Akka, which was part of that northern part of Palestine near the coast.
Right.
And so maybe you can start us out by talking about anything you want to share about the land in which you come from, the Palestine or the Palestinian people, and we'll start there.
Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for having me. As you noticed in the picture that they were shown, although they're black and white, but you can still see the beauty of Palestine. And so it was a beautiful country, and it was, a country with all the means of civilization. So it had good economy, school system, airports, all kinds of requirements for a country to be successful. Actually, it was successful. So what you hear, like, when they create this, when they expelled the Palestinians, they said, okay, land for people, for no, a land without people, for people without a land, which is not true, because that land had people, and that land had a civilization that's over 4,000 years. So it's an ancient civilization. It's beautiful. They had economy like in 1929, when there was a famine, like, in the global, like, hunger. So Pakistan did not experience that. Actually, they have abundant, kind of food, and they were distributing. They were helping other countries that were in need. Actually, my son told me, his father told him a story that his grandmother, she used to bake bread and send all her sons. She had her sons that she sent them to the border, because we lived on the north of the Polish border, Lebanon on the south, and them there to give to poor people, like, people that were in need. So it was, it was a good country. It had economy, it has civilization. Akka was a beautiful, and I mean, it still is beautiful, but it was beautiful at the time. It was known for its oranges. They are known of Akka and Jaffa, also another city that is, close to Akka. They used to export oranges to all over the world. They used to use boxes of oranges. It's kind of like a barter system where they want to exchange for goods to import. So they export the boxes of oranges. They also they had olive trees, and so they make oils, and they had the business of having olives and olive oil. At the time when the Jews started coming to Palestine, like late 1800s and early 1900s, the Jews that were, they were coming, they were good. I mean, they were nice Jews, and they got along with the Palestinians. They were there, like Palestinian Muslims. There were Muslims, Christians, and Druze. So they got along with them, and they lived peacefully, and they had no problems. Sometimes, some of the Jews that were, from my experience now and learning about what's going on, I would say they were members of the terrorist group that actually were killing the Palestinians when they started to try to have them, like, get rid of them so they can, conquer Palestine. They were looting the Palestinians, the crops and all that, to make them, to have them, like, to hate to stay there and to feel unsafe, so they could leave. Okay.
Miss Kadura.
Okay. Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, you're good. You're good.
Okay.
I recognize. Oh, no, go ahead.
So Akka also had, where my parents are from. They came from, it's a little town that is suburbs of Akka. It's called Al Kabri. Al Kabri was known for its like spring water. It tasted very good. They called it Nab al Asal, which means like honey water, or like, water of honey, because it was so good. That water, it used to like feed, I don't know how to say the word, like feed to acre. It was like 9 million cubic meters per year. So the Israelis, they destroyed it. Now that Al Kabri, where my parents lived, that there's no town. There's no town there. All destroyed. It's all destroyed.
You know, we see that military occupation and violence has forced displacement for so many people, right? And
Yeah.
we're here in Arizona, so we're familiar with different types of stories, especially from
Mhm.
South America, of like military occupation and displacement. And I think it's so important for people who have never experienced that to understand that experience. And so, you know, maybe for our second question, how has occupation impacted your life in the diaspora?
Oh, it affected in a negative way. Up till now, it's still affecting actually, my sister. Yeah. So when my parents were expelled, they were forced to leave because under guns and and they were afraid for their lives. So they went to Lebanon because Lebanon bordered their town. So they walked. They didn't fly. They didn't go by plane or cars or anything. They walked. So they stayed at the nearest town, which was called Anna. Well, it's still there, Anna. And they stayed for about a year, and then they went to Beirut, which is the capital of Lebanon. So they lived there in camps, and camps it's in the sense of actually it's tents. They were tents. I didn't experience it. The time I was born, the tents were not there anymore. They had built like houses for the Palestinians for each family, but houses they were not only like 2 rooms and a kitchen, no bathroom, no running water, none of that stuff. So and their houses were built like the walls were from concrete, but the ceiling was just tin. So when they build it, so sometimes there are holes in the ceiling. Okay, so in the winter, I remember this vividly. I mean, when we're sleeping in the winter time, of course, we didn't have heating system, we didn't have heaters, and we're all cuddled in the blanket, like 3 or 4 blankets. So water would drop on our face. So if my parents, and I remember, if they wanted to fix it, they would have to get a permission from the Lebanese government, and they wouldn't give it to them. But if they give it to them, but if they try to fix it without giving the permission, they know about it, they come and they destroy that and they find the money. Okay, so this is one of the things. So we didn't have running water. We didn't have. I used to go and fetch water for my family since I was the oldest girl. um I know it would be like in the camp they were like each, like I remember it was my parents, my uncle, my aunts, and we're all together, like and that would be like a quarter. So for that quarter it's like about 10 families, and they all have a lot of good children. So we would have a public bathroom that was shared by everyone, and those public bathrooms, they didn't have doors. We had, it's so no privacy. We didn't have, like, I had to go and take the trash every day to a certain place where they, that place for the people that lived around it. Well, my cousin was one of them. They would have bugs and rodents and all that. But then also, like, maybe once a week they burn it, and the smoke would, fill up the air, and it's really bothers them. So it was really rough. And also the water, I used to also go and fetch water every single day. It was very hard in the winter time, but in the summer it was okay. It was good. I liked it. Now, also up till now, Palestinians are not okay. In Lebanon, we were born in Lebanon. All of us were born in Lebanon. None of us have Lebanese citizenship. We have a travel document that we can travel, So it's like for somebody that gets a green card and they want to travel, they will get it's not a passport, but it's a travel document. So we say Palestinian refugees from, in Lebanon. So we will have that. Palestinians are not allowed to hold several jobs. Okay. They're not allowed. Like my sister now, her 2 sons are dentists. They can't open their own practice. They work in a clinic that is owned by a Lebanese, guy. We can't, we buy houses. I have a house in Lebanon, but we cannot register. It's not registered in my name. It's still in the name of the owner, although it's all paid for. But it's
Yeah.
still his name. We cannot register it. We cannot. During there was civil war in Lebanon in 1973. My brother got killed from, he got killed by a sniper, because it's Palestinian, by somebody, from, the other group, that they didn't want the Palestinians there. It was difficult, very difficult for Palestinians, but, and it still is. There also, being a Palestinian also followed us here. My husband, when he finished his doctorate degree, he got a PhD in analytical chemistry. He applied to a the College of Petroleum Engineering in Saudi Arabia. They had a recruiter, but we were living in Ohio. They had a recruiter in Houston, so he flew to Houston. He interviewed, and he got the job, and he signed an offer and everything. And when they were trying to get his papers done, so they asked him for the passport to send it. He sent it. When they knew he was Palestinian, they withdrew the offer. They didn't give him that. And that happened also to my brother back in Lebanon. Also the same thing. They didn't allow him.
It's compounded struggle. Like the struggle and the resilience in your story reminds me of a phrase I hear often that comes from the struggle of displaced people. And it's, they tried to bury us, they tried to scatter us, but they didn't know we were seeds, right?
Yeah,
and like that struggle to survive and to stay and to break ground, right? In the face of all the adversity. And then to still organize, right? To organize one of the largest global movements, even in the face of all that struggle. There's a lot to appreciate there. I have one more question for you, Ms. Kadura. And it is, what are your hopes and vision for the future of Palestine?
I tell you, how I said earlier that when the Jews were coming to Palestine, there were some good Jews. There are still some good Jews now. The ones that are not good are the Zionists. They're not really, they have nothing to do with Judaism. But anyway, so my mother's neighbor was a Jew. So when they were trying to leave because they were afraid, their town was bombarded and everything. So they were afraid they were going to leave. So her neighbor was a Jew, and she told her, no, don't go, stay, because they were good together. They loved each other, and so to me, that means that they can live together peacefully. Jews, Muslims, Christians, and Druze, Palestinians, all can live together in peace. Just move away Zionism. No Zionism, there will be peace. Not just there, everywhere in the world.
Thank you, Ms. Kadura. I appreciate all of your time and your sharing. You heard it here first, right? Abolish the supremacy element. That's what we
Exactly.
Right?
Yes, yeah, exactly.
Thank you so much. We are gonna, we are at, let's see what the time check is. We're at 6:35. So just a quick announcement to everybody. We know we set this till 7. We are likely to go to about 7:15, 7:20. I hope you all can stick with us. We have really great information. Again, one more round of applause or emojis for Ms. Kadura, and I will pass it over to Ria to get us into a little bit more history of colonization. Thank you again.
Thank you very much for having me. I enjoyed it.
Thank you so much.
Welcome.
Yeah, I'm putting, so my part, I'm like, putting together like the stories that Ms. Kadura just shared into like a more historical overview, but I will go fast with it because at this point we have to recognize that, like you don't need to know every single nuanced part of this history to know that what's happening right now is wrong and that the occupation must end. Yeah, so before we jump into history and narrative, we wanted to take the time to define colonization first, because that is, the aspect of this Let's Talk today. So, you should all be pretty familiar that since we are ourselves living on occupied land that has been and continues to be systematically stolen from the people indigenous to them, like Lola said earlier. And the so-called forefathers of this country employed the same brutal and destructive means here that laid the groundwork for what we see happening in both Palestine and across the world today. So in the simplest terms, colonization is the act of taking control of an area or a country that is not your own through force, specifically to extract resources. When we add the settler element into it, we see settler colonialism as a system of power that perpetuates the genocide and erasure of indigenous peoples and cultures. So settlers leave their own countries or places to become an active part of the colonial project by occupying these unceded and unsurrendered traditional homelands to, quote, carve out a new homeland for themselves. And this, I take this quote from Decolonize Palestine, which is a really, really great source. Literally decolonizepalestine.com or org, I'm not sure. But yeah, so right here on this slide that we're looking at this framework that was created by a Berkeley sociologist, Robert Blauner, and he identified 4 key components of colonization back in the 60s. And as you look through them, I'm gonna actually read them out loud. So the first is forced entry into a territory and its population. Second is alteration or destruction of the indigenous culture and patterns of social organization. The third one is domination of the indigenous population by representatives of the invading society. And the fourth is justification of such activities with highly prejudicial racist beliefs and stereotypes. And we want to like go through these to really get an idea of what they mean. But before we look at those components and how they played out in Israel's occupation of Palestine, we also want to quickly define 2 other terms essential to understanding what's happening. And you must, these 2 terms, you must have seen them on the internet, on social media, from Palestinians themselves to describe this. And it's really important to really understand the definition. So the legal definition of apartheid can best be understood as an institutionalized regime of prolonged and cruel oppression by one racial group toward another with the intention to control the second group and deprive them of political and civil rights. And this is like a way that lots of people have referenced, including Maslov ourselves, what the Israeli state is. It's an apartheid state. And, technically it's prohibited by international law. So no apartheid state really has a right to exist. And, the most famous example, of course, is apartheid South Africa. But if we look closer to home, we should definitely be thinking of, the mere existence of the US, but also like Jim Crow America and how racial segregation continues to legally exist in the US today. The next term we want to define is Zionism. So, and that's important because there's so much misinformation about what it really is. So Zionism is a political ideology originating from Europe in the late 1800s, which had the goal of establishing, and I'm quoting here a Palestinian historian, Noor Masalha, where he says that the goal of establishing a Jewish state through colonization and land acquisition. And it is a colonial project. If you read about its founders and what they've said about it, they name it as a colonial project. Okay, so now that we've defined these 2 terms and contextualized them, we want to give you some examples. So if we go to the next slide. Okay, perfect. So the first component was forced entry into a territory and its population. So we want to make clear that, like Ms. Kadura said, Zionist efforts to colonize Palestine began nearly a century before the Holocaust. At this point, again, like I said, at this point, you don't need to know every single nuance to understand that it's colonialism, the occupation is wrong, etc. But, if you look at this really great visual from an amazing source called Visualizing Palestine, you can kind of see exactly, and again, you've probably seen some variation of this graphic around the internet, but you can see the way that like the indigenous population, Palestinians were moved and sequestered while the Zionist colonialist occupied land. I'm not going to go too deep into it. We'll definitely be sharing the slides later. So you can really explore everything. And, between 1882 and 1947, we saw, Britain had the caucasity to give Palestine to Israel in order to create its own religious ethno-state, another colonial project. We talk about, the Nakba, the Naksa in 1967, and all of these periods of time where Palestinians were expelled out of their lands, or again, racially segregated to create that religious ethno-state. And right now, even today, during 2023, the Al-Aqsa flood, Israel is already calling for the annexation of Gaza. So there's that. Okay, and then if we go to the next slide, a really great way of looking at that population transfer, which is, again, a component of forced entry, a component of settler colonialism. Okay. And then if we go to the next slide, we're going to talk about another component, the second component, which is alteration or destruction of the indigenous culture and patterns of social organization. I think this component is really easy to see. Israel's cultural apartheid of Palestine is notorious. And to me, one of the most wild and like ridiculously pathetic things I've seen personally. For example, like you can think of the appropriation of Palestinian culinary traditions that they've repackaged as, quote, Israeli food. So there's like memes about this. The last image, this is traditional food, you can read that as a meme, completely true. And then like recently this American actress, was like, I'm eating Israeli food and listening to Israeli rock, and it's like a picture of a falafel sandwich. So people were like really going in at her in the comments. If there's any Palestinian folks in here, if you'd like to drop in other things that like have been like rebranded as Israeli cultural products or whatever, feel free to do so. There's also the Jaffa oranges, and that's like a big component of the BDS goal. So the Sabra hummus, za'atar, et cetera, et cetera. And then if we go to the next slide, Dabka dance, food, music, yes. Oh my gosh, couscous. Yes, thank you so much. Okay. Oh my God, that's terrible. They just recently appropriated from the river to the sea after calling it genocidal. Yeah. Yeah, oh my gosh, keep them coming. But I will go to, this slide. But we've also seen the ways the Israeli occupation forces have also targeted and destroyed Palestinian heritage, like the olive tree. And you've probably seen this really famous photo and how much it symbolizes Palestinian resistance as them being the true stewards of this land. And then if we go to the next slide. Okay, so this is also seen in the ways that this component is also seen in the ways the Israeli occupation forces have always targeted and destroyed Palestinian heritage sites. So these are sites that have like existed longer than the state of Israel itself. During this current bombardment of Gaza, Israel has managed to destroy 33 mosques and 3 churches by October 25th. And you can really read about how old these heritage sites are. These are cultural sites, these are religious sites, and it's just a complete destruction of land and culture and erasure. But no matter how hard the state of Israel tries, Palestinians have resisted these attempts to erase their rich culture and heritage. I mean, we can see it in the words that Ms. Kadura, like the way that she talked about it and the way that she passed down her culture to her kids. It's amazing. They just can't, like Israel just can't do that. Like they can't win, no matter how much they try. So if we go to the next slide, we're going to talk about the next component, which is domination of the indigenous population by representatives of the invading society. So there's a lot of images here, and these photos show exactly why we call Israel an apartheid state. There's checkpoints, borders, the everyday violence of the Israeli occupation force. If you read the captions, if you're able to, you can kind of see that physical segregation of, that allows, there's roads only for Israeli Jews, there's roads only, for Palestinians, et cetera, et cetera. And, even before I learned more, one of the most enduring images of the occupation I've always associated with the reality of Palestine were images of the IOF brutalizing and manhandling Palestinian children. And you can see that in the top right image. Literally, like, there's so many images similar to this of Palestinian children being brutalized by the IOF. And it really reminds you of the police here and their treatment of like Black children, Indigenous children. There's so many images that are completely true. And then if you go to the next slide, Allison, thank you. Okay, and then this is another, it's an article, but it's a photo of the actual segregated roads that displace Palestinians. And wow, that sounds really familiar to something that's happening here too. So if we go to the next slide, thank you. The last component was justification of such activities with highly prejudicial racist beliefs and stereotypes. You know, we don't have to go back that far back to see some obvious examples of these components. If you look at the original Zionist colonialists and the people who founded this ideology, the way that they talk about Arabs, the indigenous Arabs of this place, you know, it's obviously very clear. And you can just see the horrifically racist and genocidal languages Israel's elected public officials and the top brass of their military publicly, you know, have said. We've even seen now videos of Israeli settlers at US protests, like saying the same disgusting things, literally assaulting people. That like ideology truly warps the mind. Yeah, so and then you can I'll stay here, but as we move to the next thing, so you know, Israel's historical recipe has always been commit internationally illegal, inhumane war atrocities, lie about it, later pompously and arrogantly admit it and repeat. Yet Israel and its imperial backers like the US and the UK continue to back these atrocities. And we want you to use this framework to interrogate what is our own relationship to the land here. You know, this land that's experienced settler colonialism for over 400 years and is seeing the continued exploitation of indigenous peoples. And yeah, with that, I want to pass it to Matt, who's going to really bring this forward, this framework forward.
Thank you, Ria. So just like Israel, the United States is a settler colonial project. White settlers journeyed to this land not simply for a better life, but these settlers played an active role in the occupation and ethnic cleansing of indigenous people to carve out a new homeland for themselves. So what we want to highlight is not only the parallels between colonization we witness here at home, but also the direct connections between the US, Israel, and all of us. So as Ria mentioned, the caucasity of Great Britain to give Palestine to Israel in order to create its own religious ethno-state. Similarly, in what we refer to as the United States, land and access to that land was granted to settlers that wished to occupy indigenous land. But who was it that granted this access, that provided the framework and facilitated the means to steal indigenous land and exploit its stewards? I'm sure you have some pretty good ideas, so throw them in the chat. You know, who was saying it's cool to do this? We do know that many European countries, Great Britain, France, and Spain, for sure, led genocidal campaigns to control land and goods, all while new state powers created legal frameworks to facilitate this ethnic cleansing and theft and destruction of this land and its indigenous stewards. They started wars to control or to deplete resources. And also, we want to make sure that folks remember this continues today for indigenous people here in the United States. Hawaiian land and Hawaiian people have not only endured exploitation and colonization efforts, but still see ongoing destruction and erasure of their culture. Puerto Rico is still currently under occupation by the US. It's not a state, not part of another state. So it's not afforded the same rights. So even though you're granted citizenship and you pay taxes to the US, you don't have that fair and adequate representation electorally, and you're still forced to live under occupation and asked to pay for it. When we move forward thinking of the alterations or the destruction of indigenous cultures, you know, earlier we mentioned Israel's overt cultural apartheid of Palestine. Much like that cultural apartheid, ours here is overt as well. When we think of native art, art is portrayed as ancestral by art galleries, something of the past, not the present, and definitely not the future. It is repackaged as Southwestern for the masses and sold in places like Old Town Scottsdale in stores ran by racists. Medicine and healing practices are rebranded as New Age and spiritual to be sold by white women with dreadlocks and dream catcher tattoos. But if we also go back just a little, it's easy for us to remember that in addition to that kind of whitewashing, the flat out erasure, many were forced into boarding schools, denied their sacred teachings, and faced violent efforts to erase not only their culture, but erase the people themselves. These schools and churches sit on unmarked grave sites of indigenous children and families. We see the loss of language and the renaming of not only people, but also holy sites. The severing of these very important ties to culture is essential to the destruction and ethnic cleansing of a population that we are no stranger to here in the US. And moving forward to the domination of indigenous population by representatives, that domination continues where we observe the immense power imbalance where the occupying forces wield their might over the population in very destructive and violent ways. So we look at points in history where we see that state power enact its violence to control, to displace, and to continue to occupy people and the land. We reference the Nakba in Palestine, which reminds us of the Trail of Tears and ethnic cleansing and mass displacement of over 60,000 natives from the Cherokee, Muskogee, Seminole, Chickasaw, and Choctaw, enacted by their violent occupying force. That was the US. We also look at the legacy and continued occupation of Black people in this country, thinking of chattel slavery and the ravaging of Africa to exploit its resources and create a global economy built on anti-Blackness, and continued violence from the US to stay in power and maintain that control. The Tulsa massacre in 1921. We talked about roads that only, if you're Palestinian, you can't drive in, thinking of sundown towns and segregation that have these legal frameworks. And of course, criminalization, that's that investment that we put into caging and killing Black people and indigenous people. And of course, that investment, that is the deadly exchange of police departments, such as the Phoenix Police Department, receiving training from Israel, the Israeli occupation force. So thinking about that criminalization and those tactics, who do we fill our prisons with? Our detention centers, our jails? Who are the people that are displaced and pushed into early death by these violent systems? And for how do they justify all of this? The justification of such activities. Over the years, we have seen many examples of how they justify all of this violence. And it makes me think of the policy, of course, but also the propaganda. The state creates the laws to uphold the state's interests. And with those laws come campaigns to vilify and to dehumanize who they wish to exploit, who they wish to disenfranchise. We've heard some of the words Israel uses for Palestinians. Here in the US, we see who is labeled as a terrorist by the state and also by the very complicit media. When we look back, we've heard Latinx folks referred to as mongrels, Black people called super predators by two-time presidential loser and Zionist Hillary Clinton, and everything Genocide Joe said when he was pushing the 1994 crime bill. And earlier, we mentioned that power imbalance and the domination that was the Trail of Tears. The Trail of Tears was part of a long-standing national campaign to quote unquote, address the Indian problem. So what we end up seeing policy-wise are things like, the Patriot Act, anti-BDS laws or clauses, and the controlling of populations through segregation. What follows is the ongoing narrative put forth by colonizers, the state, to delegitimize resistance efforts and dehumanize a subjugated people or population. Thinking about also how our protesters that resist state violence, here in 2020, folks that marched for Black Lives were portrayed in a negative light. Media and state officials, in efforts to delegitimize, said that people were being bussed in from out of state, that they didn't live here, they weren't from here. In addition, you know, all the calls of you can't protest that way, you have to resist peacefully, you know, paired with those prosecutions that we see from the state, the Maricopa County Attorney's Office, also painting them as violent and fictitious street gangs. So that delegitimization and dehumanization come hand in hand with the colonial projects and how dissent is stamped out. And of course, lastly, I want to mention Cop City. Not only the investment in an infrastructure by, of course, into the propaganda machine to depict land protectors as violent in a negative light. Tortuguita was murdered by police on January 18th of this year, but police claimed that it was Tortuguita that shot and injured an officer, only to later find out that that officer was shot by another officer. This propaganda and continued narrative helps to embolden also state supporters that succumb to this propaganda, which we see in folks deputizing themselves as actors of the state, policing their own neighborhoods, people that work in office that decide to fire Palestinians or people who support Palestine and things like that. So it is not just the state. Lastly, I want to mention the reach of the US is long and it is powerfully violent. Just like Israel, there is a hand in continued colonization and ethnic cleansing all over the globe, but definitely not limited, you know, to what we've talked about. You know, there's Haiti, Sudan, the Congo, the list goes on. And it is in the interests of these state powers to empower and support these continued colonial projects, these continued genocidal campaigns. Remember, Genocide Joe says, if there wasn't an Israel, we'd have to invent an Israel to protect our interests. So our struggles are connected not only because of what we've seen in the past, the history, our struggles are connected because of what is going on right now in this moment, and also what it means for our future. With that, I'm gonna pass it over to Patricia for some calls to action and to close us out.
Matt, thank you so much. Sharia, Lola, Julian, Rami, Miss Kadura, thank you so very much, everyone, for your effort. So Matt and Ria clearly laid out all of the harms of colonization that we are all complicit in. And if you take a breath and check in with how you're doing, it probably feels pretty terrible, and it should. That's why love and rigor is one of our values. We need to really face into our feelings. We need to really lean into our feelings of discomfort and fear instead of turning away or numbing out. We've got to make sure that we stay engaged in this moment. And yes, it's been 5 weeks, and yes, it will continue. But like Mariam Kaba said, we need to let this radicalize us. We need to be so clear in this moment. What is it that you're willing to risk? Risk is required. We all need to be willing to move out of our comfort zone and interrupt the violence of colonization. That means not being silent when anyone around you is spewing hateful Zionist talking points or sharing false news. We must disrupt any and every attempt to dehumanize Palestinian people, because we know that is a tactic of the system used by politicians and news anchors and all of those good people in our neighborhood that just want us to go back to peace, just go back to the way it was. This is what Palestinian people have had to resist their entire lives, and they will not stop resisting that colonial violence. So this is your formal invitation now to fully, unapologetically commit to solidarity with Gaza's resistance. It's pretty clear now from where we sit that you are on the wrong side of history. If you look back and say, well, Indigenous people in America or enslaved people or Black people in the Jim Crow South were too violent and too loud and too resisty in their resistance of these colonizing forces. So we're on board. We know the history. We know what's happening in the present moment. We know apartheid and occupation is unacceptable and we must resist it. So what do we do? It's super straightforward, friends. We have to stay focused. We have to fortify ourselves in this moment. Rest is essential. Joy is essential to stay in this movement long term. However, we need to remember that when we feel tired, our friends, our siblings in Palestine, the bombing has not stopped. When are they resting? When are they eating? We need to have the strength in our hearts that they have in theirs, and we need to show up in solidarity again and again. There are rallies, actions, sit-ins, protests and happening in your city. And yes, it matters that you show up. Yes, it matters that you're posting on social media. If you physically cannot make it to a rally, a protest, or a sit-in, post on socials, text your friends, email your friends, and invite them. Show up if you are scared. Show up if you are tired. Show up and show out and bring your people. We are going to drop a bit.ly into the chat that has a list longer than Palestine is wide, with resources, with Palestinian voices from Gaza and the diaspora for you to follow. We need you to share their voices. We need you to continue showing up to protests, following on social media, and most important, taking action as you are called to do in solidarity with Gazan resistance. We are going to close with words from Malcolm X to remind you why the struggle for Black liberation is so closely tied to Palestinian liberation. And then after this video, we'll play a little music to usher you all out with deep gratitude. Palestine will be free.
Palestinian struggle is not just a cry for justice. It's a blistering battle for the most fundamental human rights that every living soul on this planet should inherit by birthright. It's an unyielding resistance against the oppressive, suffocating grip of occupation and the callous denial of the most basic human dignity. Just as the civil rights movement in the United States fought against the chains of racial discrimination, so too do the Palestinian people strive to shatter the chains of occupation and tyranny. Never forget, my friends, that the Palestinians, much like African Americans in the United States, have been subjected to a heart-wrenching history of suffering and torment. The birth of Israel in 1948 brought forth the mass expulsion and dispossession of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians from their ancestral homes and land. This is a historic injustice that continues to haunt the lives of Palestinians to this very day. The situation in Palestine serves as a brutal reminder of the consequences of colonialism and the ruthless dispossession of indigenous peoples. It is an agonizing reminder that the fight for justice knows no borders, and we must stand united in solidarity with all oppressed peoples, whether they reside in the United States, South Africa, or anywhere around the world. Let's be unequivocally clear. Advocating for the rights of the Palestinian people is not synonymous with denying the rights and security of the Jewish people. The fight for justice in Palestine is not an assault on any particular group, but an unwavering stand against the policies of a Zionist state that has for far Palestinians of their rights. We must remember that numerous Jewish voices also resound in the calls for justice and peace in Palestine, and their voices must not be silenced. In our relentless pursuit of justice for the Palestinian people, we must also acknowledge that it is in the best interest of the entire world to seek a just and enduring solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It is a pursuit in the name of peace, stability, and the dignity of all mankind. But let me underscore this. The battle for justice in Palestine is not merely a political struggle, it's an elemental moral battle. It's the fight for the most basic human rights of a people who have suffered these injustices for far too long. It's the fight for the right to exist in peace and security, free from the ceaseless specter of violence and dispossession. If you're not careful, the newspapers will have you hating the people who are being oppressed and loving the people who are doing the oppressing. I implore every person of conscience, regardless of their origins or beliefs, to stand steadfast with the Palestinian people in their unwavering quest for justice by any means necessary. Let us unite in building a world where every soul can live in freedom and dignity, where the rights of every individual are not just respected, but celebrated. The struggle for justice in Palestine is a universal fight, a resonating echo of the battles waged by oppressed people across the globe. It's a battle we must champion, a torch we must carry, and a legacy we must honor. Thank you, and free Palestine.
Free Palestine!